There are 5 groups of philosophical Hermetic writings that do not appear in Brian P. Copenhaver's 1992 English translation entitled Hermetica. The first is the large group of Hermetic excerpts from Stobaeus, an early 5th century CE anthologist. The second is the Coptic Hermetica, discovered in 1945, featuring 2 excerpts of previously known writings, in addition to a formerly unknown Hermetic revelatory tractate. The 8th reveals the 9th. The third group is the collection of Hermetic definitions, a set of maxims extant in Greek fragments, but preserved only fully in Armenian. The fourth is the previously known set of diverse fragments quoted by various largely Christian authors in late antiquity up until the Middle Ages. The fifth comprises recently discovered Hermetic fragments currently preserved in Vienna and Oxford. What I translate in Hermetica 2 are the fragments of Stobaeus, the fragments and testimonies from various authors, and the fragments from the newly discovered papyri. Along with my translation comes a full set of notes and introductions for the reader. For those of you new to the Hermetica, it suffices here to introduce the figure of Hermes Thoth. For nothing binds together the various Hermetic fragments beyond their ascription to this figure, also called Hermes Trismegistus, or the thrice great. The thrice great is indeed a fictional character. Yet for many in the ancient world, that fiction was sacred history. If we call Hermes thrice great a myth, we thereby recognize that he is greater and more significant than any one historical figure. How do we introduce a figure that appears in so many different ages, in so many different guises? If there was an original Hermes thrice great, we may not have access to him. We are obliged to pick up the thread at a significant point of reception. The Neoplatonist philosopher Iamblichus, who lived between about 245 and 325, commences his book, later called On the Mysteries, with the following flourish, quote, Hermes, the deity who presides over rational discourses, has long and rightly been considered common to all who practice the sacred arts. He who presides over true science concerning gods is one and the same throughout the universe. It is to him that our ancestors dedicated the discoveries of their wisdom, attributing all their writings to Hermes. Important here is the frank acknowledgement that many authors wrote under the name of Hermes. The practice of pseudepigraphy was logical for devotees of the thrice great. True wisdom and learning merited ascription to the Lord of all learning, and this is why many Egyptian scholars attributed their writings to Hermes. Iamblichus himself, writing under a false name Abamon, an Egyptian priest, calls these writers his ancestors. These ancestors were probably Hellenized Egyptian priests who lived not very long before Iamblichus himself. Later, Iamblichus gives a taste of how many persons were writing under the name of Hermes. In On the Mysteries 8, chapter 1, he passes on the report of a certain Seleucus, who attributed to Hermes a total of 20,000 books. And a better-known source, the Egyptian priest and historian Manetho, nearly doubled this number, crediting Hermes with 36,525 volumes. That is 100 volumes for each single day in a 4-year period. So many books would easily fill the shelves of a large temple library called the House of Life in Egyptian. Perhaps this is the point. All the wisdom of the Egyptian sacred priesthood ultimately goes back to Hermes. According to Iamblichus, Hermes wrote hundreds of tomes on specialized topics like the gods in the fiery zone, or the gods in the aether, or the gods in the heavens. Hermes was the ultimate theologian, yet the scope of his expertise was in fact more vast. There are existing treatises on astrology, the virtues of stones, the principles of creation, the origin and nature of the soul, alchemical practices, fate, the effects of climate on intelligence, healing, and even why children resemble their parents, all ascribed to Hermes. The many genres of Hermetic learning are well illustrated by a passage in Clement of Alexandria. This Christian writer, around 200 of the Common Era, describes a procession of Egyptian officials in which 42 fundamental writings of Hermes were displayed. This is the number of Egypt's districts or nomes. The highest ranking priest, whom the Greeks called prophet, carried the 10 hieratic books on laws, the gods, and the training of priests. The stole keeper presented 10 books on education and sacrifice. The sacred scribe held up a decade of books on hieroglyphs, geography, and temples. Then came the astrologer, who showed 4 books on astronomical matters, fixed stars, planets, conjunctions, and the risings of astral bodies. Finally, the singer held in his hands a songbook and an instruction manual for kings. As a supplement, 6 books on medical matters, anatomy, medicines, medical instruments, and gynecology were displayed. All this vast store of knowledge was ascribed to Hermes. So who was Hermes? Well, we must first distinguish a Greek deity from the significantly different Egyptian one. The Greek Hermes was the winged son of kindly Maia, racing on the winds as Zeus's crafty herald, helmeted with the cap of invisibility, wielding the twisted caduceus with the power to put even Argus with his 100 eyes to sleep. The Egyptian Hermes, on the other hand, was Thoth, depicted as the ibis-headed scribe of the gods, secretary of Re, giver of oracles, master of magic, lord of the moon, often appearing in the form of a dog-faced baboon. When the Greeks dominated Egypt, they identified the Egyptian god Thoth with Hermes. But why? What did they see in these two gods that was similar? There are at least 2 overlaps. First of all, Hermes as psychopomp, or escort of the souls, resembled Thoth as seen in various versions of the Egyptian Book of the Dead, or the Book of Going Forth by Day, chapter 125. In the Hall of Two Truths, Thoth hears the confession of the deceased person. After the person's heart is weighed against the feather of Ma'at, justice or truth, Thoth carefully inscribes the result with his tablet and stylus. If the heart is pure, Thoth leads the candidate into the presence of Osiris, the ultimate judge of the dead, and finally into the field of reeds. Perhaps the most famous scene of Hermes leading souls is the opening of Homer's Odyssey, Book 24. In this scene, Hermes guides the freshly slaughtered suitors of Penelope to the netherworld. Mindless, these suitors squeak like bats on their way to the halls of Hades. Yet there was a more basic similarity between Hermes and Thoth. Hermes is more than a herald or messenger. He is the logos, the reason, the speech, or the word of God. The word devises speech and brings his own interpretation, which in Greek is hermeneia. Thoth is also the god who presides over speech and interpretation. He is called the heart of Re, the tongue of Atum, the throat of the god whose name is hidden. As divine speech personified, Thoth is also a creator. What bursts from his heart has immediate existence. What he pronounces exists for eternity. In the Hellenistic period, Greeks living in Egypt and Hellenized Egyptians crafted an amalgam of Thoth and Hermes, who was called the Egyptian Hermes, or later Hermes thrice great. This Hermes is superlatively great in a superlative way, as was expressed by 3. Greeks typically conceived of Hermes thrice great in a euhemeristic fashion. That is to say, they often considered him to have been an ancient man, a real scribe of a real pharaoh, often the first pharaoh called Amun, the Egyptian god Amun. This scribe, named Thoth or Theuth, invented the alphabet or the art of writing. Ever since, humans have been using writing to preserve the vast array of accumulated knowledge. Thoth was later deified to become a recognized Egyptian god or daimon, a kind of mediating deity. Writing was the best known benefit that Thoth offered to human beings, but it was not the only one. Greeks attributed to Thoth the invention of a host of other arts. Plato made Thoth the discoverer of mathematics and astronomy. Hecataeus of Abdera, in the 4th century BCE, described to him the invention of a common language, religious ritual, music, wrestling, dancing, and the culture of the olive. The Jewish writer Artapanus, from the 3rd to the 2nd century BCE, identified Moses with Hermes, making him also the teacher of navigation, the deviser of weapons, machines of war, and philosophy. According to the Roman orator Cicero in the mid-1st century BCE, Hermes Thoth gave the Egyptians their laws and letters. In the early 1st century CE, the Roman poet Manilius called Hermes the first founder of this great and holy science, meaning astrology. The Christian writer Tertullian in the early 3rd century CE dubbed Hermes, thrice great, teacher of all the natural philosophers. This tradition of philosophy stretched back to Thales in the 6th century BCE. When one reads these testimonies, which I print at the end of my volume Hermetica 2, one gains a sense of the vast knowledge ascribed to Hermes. There was nary a branch of learning over which the thrice great did not preside. To the question, why was the Egyptian Hermes called thrice great? One can answer, triple greatness was the special prerogative of Thoth. A god twice or thrice great was a god supremely great, greater indeed than all his divine competitors, at least in the minds of his devotees. Clay shards in the archive of Hor, around 168 BCE, yield a Greek translation of Thoth's Egyptian epithet, the greatest, yes, the greatest god, great Hermes. And in Egyptian, the repetition likely had a distributive sense. Thoth is great on every occasion, at all times, in every respect. The earliest that the great Hermes attained his epithet thrice great, it seems, is with Thrasyllus of Alexandria, the famous astrologer of the Emperor Tiberius. In Greek, threeness evokes the notion of perfection and pluripotentiality. Hermes is the greatest god, and his manifold powers were available in multiple ways. In this respect, Martial's playful line about the gladiator called Hermes ironically sums up the essence of the Greco-Egyptian god. Hermes is all things in one, and thrice unique. As the god of human sciences, both esoteric and empirical, Hermes, thrice great, remained a fundamentally Egyptian deity. He is the Egyptian Hermes. The Greek Hermes, after all, was never really a scholar or patron of scholars, at least until late antiquity. Though an interpreter, a messenger, a thief, a deceiver, the Greek Hermes was never a scribe or the inventor of writing. Yet writing and scribal wisdom were associated with Thoth centuries before the Homeric Hermes. The Egyptian character of the thrice great is highlighted in the Greek magical papyri. These papyri are priceless testimonies of Egyptian domestic religion from the 1st to the 4th centuries of the Common Era. In one hymn recorded in the papyri, Hermes is called ruler of the world, the circle of the moon, founder of the words of speech, pleader of justice's cause, eye of the sun, founder of full-voiced speech, sender of oracles, universal healer, and the one who brings full mental powers. In a slightly longer version of the hymn, Hermes is called Lord of the Elements, helmsman of the world, and the world's very order. The creative role of Hermes is further underscored in another spell where Hermes is the one who made the 4 quarters of the heaven and the 4 foundations of the earth. According to yet another spell, Thoth, much like the Hebrew god, brings existence out of non-existence and non-existence from existent things. He is the true sight of whose face none of the gods have ever endured to see. As universal creator, Hermes is also the universal knower of things hidden beneath heaven and earth. Greek philosophers tapped into the wisdom of Hermes by, according to legend at least, visiting Egypt and sitting at the feet of Hermes' heirs, the Egyptian priests. These priests were naturally reluctant to share their sacred wisdom, but their visitors proved persistent. According to tradition, all the greatest philosophers, among them Pythagoras, Solon, Eudoxus, Plato, Democritus, among many others, came to study abroad in Egypt. Even if one grants the historicity of these sojourns, one reasonably doubts that all these Greeks learned the specific wisdom later associated with the thrice great. Yet, if all Egyptian wisdom ultimately derives from Thoth, then Greece's finest sages could later be viewed as this god's disciples. Only on occasion, however, is the connection between the philosophers and Hermes made explicit. According to Tertullian, Plato was especially intimate with the Egyptian Hermes. Iamblichus affirms that Pythagoras and Plato, during their visits to Egypt, carefully studied the stelae or inscribed pillars of Hermes with the help of native priests. By late antiquity, Hermes the Egyptian was viewed as the supreme philosopher, or rather the one who stood at the head of the Greek philosophical tradition. Hermes was not a historical author, but he did possess an important author function. His name guaranteed the antiquity and validity of a host of Greco-Egyptian writings that addressed important scientific and philosophical topics of the time. Yet Hermes the Egyptian meant more than Hermes the ancient sage. His Egyptian identity guaranteed the importance and prestige of Egypt throughout the Hellenistic world. To the Greeks, Hermes thrice great represented the wisdom of Egypt, just like Moses came to symbolize the wisdom of the Jews, Ostanes the wisdom of the Persians, and Dandamus the wisdom of India. In terms of the discursive practices of late antiquity, the Hermetic writings were deeply Hellenic in form and language. Nevertheless, Hermes never stopped being Egyptian, and the Hermetic writings never lost their Egyptian roots and local color. What about the question of Hermetic communities? Well, Hermetic literature refers to named disciples and teachers like Hermes, Tot, Amon, Isis, Horus, and so on. Do these literary characters reflect a social reality of Hermetic teaching in small circles? If so, what group did Hermetic teachers belong to? Where did this group or groups meet? And what did they do in their meetings? Theories have come and gone. Richard Reitzenstein initially proposed a kind of Hermetic mother church located in Egypt. By contrast, Jean-André Festigier found no trace in the Hermetic literature of ceremonies belonging to supposed believers in Hermes, nothing that resembles sacraments. There is no clergy, no appearance of hierarchical organization, no degree of initiation. On the contrary, Hermeticism forthrightly expresses its loathing for material acts of worship. But after the discovery of the Nag Hammadi writings, Quispel could declare that it's now completely certain that there existed, before and after the beginning of the Christian era, in Alexandria, a secret society akin to a Masonic lodge. The members of the group called themselves Brethren, were initiated through a baptism of the Spirit, celebrated a sacred meal, and read the Hermetic writings as edifying treatises for their spiritual progress. More cautiously, Jean-Pierre Mahet observed that the prayers in the Hermetic corpus provide evidence that there were communities placed under the patronage of Hermes in which prayer, characterized as a sacrifice of speech, could have the place of a true sacrament. Today, most scholars seem persuaded that references to pure food, a ritual embrace, and formal prayers suggest some sort of ritual and community life. Christian H. Bull, in part, revives the idea of Reitzenstein that Hermetic communities were led by Egyptian priests increasingly detached from temple service and administration. Partial support for this idea comes from the Book of Thoth, a book written in the Egyptian priestly language called Demotic, which circulated in the 1st and 2nd centuries of our era. In the book, Thoth, or someone who shares his epithets, dialogues with one seeking knowledge. The book emerged from Egyptian priestly circles and it deals with native Egyptian lore. Although most of this lore doesn't overlap with the contents of the philosophical Hermetica, the genre and format of the Book of Thoth strongly resembles these writings. It must be kept in mind, however, that the community life of the Hermetic practitioners is almost entirely reconstructed from the Hermetic texts themselves. External witnesses sometimes refer to Egyptian priests living in temple complexes or passing on their wisdom or singing the vowels, but none of these refer to what we would call a Hermetic community. One could imagine a Hermetic community as a kind of philosophical discussion group, a school with a master teacher, a loose collection of individuals seeking salvation through initiatory readings, or a fluid blend of all these models. With regard to late antiquity, one should take seriously the proposal of Julia Svameni-Gasparo that what developed was something like a Hermetic audience cult. Such cults do not display formal organization or constitute structured groups devoted to a dogmatic creed, but rather participate in a common heritage of knowledge and interest. The philosophical treatises of Hermes were religious and initiatory, but they came to be read more and more like school exercises. Like Platonic dialogues, Hermetic dialogues were later dissected for the opinions of Hermes. These opinions were then incorporated into lists of opinions called doxographies. John Stobaeus, for instance, quoted Hermes as an ancient philosophical authority for the education of his son. Late antique Christian authors like Lactantius and Cyril quoted Hermes as a theological authority to prove the antiquity of their creeds. The Hermes of Iamblichus was a theosophical expert explaining a universal way of salvation. Naturally, there were no hard and fast distinctions between what we call theosophy, theology, and philosophy in the ancient world. The point is that Hermes had come to represent an ancient authoritative discourse. For the educated elite, the discourse that interested them tended to be philosophical and scientific. Hermes was an authority on philosophy, medicine, and astronomy because his wisdom lay at the root of all these disciplines. How do we date the Hermetic writings? Well, since the days of Isaac Casaubon, the treatises in the Byzantine collection, called the Corpus Hermeticum, have been dated anywhere from the late 1st to the late 3rd centuries of the Common Era. The Perfect Discourse, or Complete Discourse, originally composed in Greek, but only fully preserved in a paraphrase, we might say, a Latin paraphrase. This probably appeared toward the end of the 3rd century, possibly even the 4th. In large part, this dating is due to internal criteria. Writers of the philosophical Hermetica were conversant with Stoicism and Middle Platonism, but not with Neoplatonism, which arose in the mid-3rd century. External witnesses to Hermetic books begin appearing in the 2nd century. Astrological writings seem to have been ascribed to Hermes as early as the 1st, some might say the 2nd century BCE. Collections of Hermetic maxims, such as we find in the Stobaean Hermetica 11, may also have appeared around this time. Hermes Thoth was recognized as an ancient sage from the time of Plato, back in the 4th century BCE. He begins to be widely recognized as a philosopher by the early 3rd century CE, as witnessed by Tertullian. There's no overriding reason to date the Stobaean and other Hermetic fragments outside the date range of the Corpus Hermeticum from the late 1st to late 3rd centuries. Perhaps more precision can be attained with regard to a peculiar collection of Hermetic treatises in which Isis addresses her son Horus. These I call the Korikosmou tractates. Now, Lucian in the mid-2nd century refers to sacred books of Horus and Isis in the inner shrines of Egyptian temples. The fact that such books were known in the Greek world made it logical for a Greek-speaking Egyptian to write Hermetic books in the name of Isis. Walter Scott used external criteria to narrow the date of one particular tractate, 23 in the normal ordering, also called the Korikosmou, or pupil of the cosmos. The treatise was written, he said, between 263 and 268, since the atrocities it speaks of reflected the calamities experienced in Alexandria during this time. As Scott himself admitted, however, matching generalized literary description to specific historical events is precarious. Slightly more secure is the stylistic criteria pointed out by Edward Norden. This is dating based on prose rhythm, and it would suggest that the Korikazmu is not earlier than around 300. Papyrologists have dated the Vienna papyri to the end of the 2nd or to the beginning of the 3rd century. The contents of the fragments themselves, however, may be a generation or two earlier. These fragments appear in numbered treatises, indicating that there were collections of Hermetic writings existing as early as the 2nd century. Some, or rather most of these collections, didn't survive. John Stobaeus made excerpts from some of them around the year 400. Authors like Tertullian, Lactantius, and Cyril were evidently reading and excerpting from other collections of philosophical Hermetica in the 3rd and 4th centuries. Cyril specifically mentions 15 Hermaic books composed in Athens. By that time, Hermes' reputation as one of the oldest sages was well established. Obviously, this Hermes was older than Jesus, and native Egyptians dated Hermes Thoth long before the time of Moses, who was excoriated by some Egyptian authors as himself an expelled leper. One Jewish author, as we saw, countered this view by identifying Moses with Hermes. Later, Christian authors worked hard to undermine Egyptian chronology, such that Hermes was considerably younger than Moses. In the famous panel in the Siena Cathedral, a kind of compromise was worked out. The enrobed and bearded Hermes was labeled explicitly as Moses' contemporary. As it turns out, there's a complex historical dialectic between Hermes, the prophet of Christianity, and his Egyptian competitor. From late antiquity to the Renaissance, Christians tended either to laud Hermes as a precursor or to scold him as a sorcerer. The Hermetic fragments and testimonies that I translate offer some of the primary sources required to trace this history. As it turns out, both Muslims and Christians interested in the science of alchemy, astrology, and natural magic found ways to integrate Hermes into their sacred histories. Some Christians, like Augustine, celebrated the destruction of Egyptian gods in late antiquity, yet the ever-transforming Egyptian Hermes survived his own prophesied apocalypse and greatly influenced the course of both science and spirituality in late antiquity and beyond. Hello, friends. Over the past 20 years, I've studied the spiritual mysteries of the ancient world, and I've come to the conclusion that many of our deepest spiritual insights in the West ultimately come from one place, the land of the Nile. The greatest and arguably the earliest Christian mystagogues and theologians were all from Alexandria. I speak of Valentinus, Basilides, Carpocrates, the Nicene preacher, among others. I've devoted the last 10 years of my life to studying these specific texts and figures, often written off as Gnostic. But to me, Gnostic is a badge of honor. These are my own personal spiritual guides, for they followed in the path of Hermes and Christ, two beings, but the same Logos speaking through time and space. I want to welcome you to join me for a transformative journey through the heart of Gnostic and Hermetic Egypt this November 4th through 12th, 2025. I call the trip Gnostic Egypt, Alexandria, and beyond. If you're interested in going, be sure to join the open house session this Sunday, August 3rd at 3 p.m. Eastern to learn more and pose questions to me and to the tour company itself. Our link to meet is in the description and is pinned in the chat. For now, let me tell you more about this trip. This is a 9-day, 8-night immersive educational tour featuring on-site lectures in places where Hermetic philosophy and early Christianity were born. You will visit the great sites. You will enter the pyramids of Giza, wonder at the brand new Grand Egyptian Museum, and go into the Saqqara necropolis. But you'll also venture off the beaten path to Alexandria and Hermopolis, the spiritual centers of Hermetic and Gnostic wisdom. Are you interested in Hermetic wisdom? I've literally wrote the book on the Hermetica, Hermetica 1 and 2, which contain every single text of the ancient philosophic Hermetica, originally in Coptic and Greek. I've taught seminars on the Hermetica both online and in the classroom, but nothing replaces learning Hermetic wisdom in the city of Hermes itself, namely Hermopolis, where the priests of Hermes died and are buried. In Hermopolis, we'll explore the underground catacombs, the subterranean sanctuary of Thoth, and the tombs of Isidora and Petosiris. I'm also a leading authority on the origins of Christianity in Alexandria, due in large part to my book, Early Christianity in Alexandria. Alexandria wasn't just the cradle of Hermetic thought. It was likely the birthplace of Christian metaphysics. Alexandria gave rise to towering spiritual figures like Philo, Valentinus, Basilides, and Clement, and, as I think, the Gospels of Thomas and John. Learn why I think so in my on-site classroom, where I'll be sharing my latest insights and research. At Alexandria, you'll see the site of the ancient lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the world. You'll visit the site of the ancient Serapeum, destroyed by Christians, and you will explore underground catacombs. We'll also visit Com El Dika, an archaeological site with real ancient classrooms and an amphitheater telling us much about the process of ancient education and philosophy. The catacombs and necropolis of Shatbi and Com El Shokofa will take us back in time when Greek culture met with Egyptian culture in a vast melting pot, giving birth not just to new styles of dress and hair, but to new modes of spirituality. Perhaps you're interested in that Jewish mystical group called the Therapeutai. Philo tells us a great deal about this group, who met on the shores of Lake Mareotis. We'll be visiting a site on this lake, Taposiris Magna, which will give us a good idea of how an ancient mystical and ascetic group lived on the outskirts of the great metropolis. Are you interested in Nag Hammadi and Coptic literature more broadly? We'll be getting exclusive access to the Coptic Museum with guidance from our personal Egyptologist. Here we will see one or more of the Nag Hammadi codices, as well as a full array of other Coptic literature. We'll also visit ancient Babylon, namely the fortress called Babylon, that is, in the heart of Old Cairo. According to 1 Peter 5:13, the author, called Peter and his son Mark, write their letter from Babylon. Did they mean Babylon in Egypt? Find out. Throughout the tour, I'll be accompanied by our own personal Egyptologist who will help me discuss the mysteries of hieroglyphics, animal worship, the symbol of the pyramid, and the mysteries of the Sphinx, which we will see up close and personal. You can take a ride on a camel or simply enjoy a cup of Turkish coffee as you gaze at the Giza Plateau. We'll also visit the Saqqara necropolis, its underground galleries known as the Serapeum, and the step pyramid of Djoser and Unas. We'll go deep in the belly of this pyramid and view the pyramid texts, arguably the oldest religious texts in the history of antiquity, dating back to around 2475 BCE. We'll also see the Old Kingdom tombs of Majorca, Ptahhotep, Kajemni, and the site of the early Christian monastery Deir Abbat Yaramiya. Traveling down the Nile, we'll visit the small village of Beni Hassan, where an important group of rock-cut tombs are carved into the high limestone cliffs on the east bank of the Nile. These tombs date mostly to the dynasties 11 and 12, although there are a few smaller and less elaborate ones belonging to dynasty 6. The tombs are reached via a flight of stone steps up the hillside, from where we will behold, with a magnificent view, the Nile River Valley. We'll also visit Amarna, the ancient Egyptian city of the sun, established by the so-called monotheist pharaoh Akhenaten and his royal wife Nefertiti, in order to bring to life his vision of a society dedicated to the cult worship of the Aten, or sun disk. This capital city was built on a previously undeveloped area under the pharaoh's direction in only a few short years, and was abandoned almost as quickly, shortly after his death around 1336 BCE. Here you'll behold the rarely seen tomb of Akhenaten himself, his vizier's unique cliffside tombs, and the remains of the royal palace and the large and small Aten temples. If you're like me, you're also a museum lover. And in addition to the Coptic Museum, we'll be visiting the Greco-Roman Museum in Alexandria, but don't get lost in the buzzing crowds. I'll be there to point out to you the mysteries of several artifacts whose significance you might have otherwise missed and quickly passed over. My friends, this is not just an educational tour. It's an initiation with daily lectures and group discussions with like minded people. Here's a list of what's included: daily lectures and group discussions with myself, additional cameo lectures throughout, a PDF reader and reference guide of ancient texts and modern texts that I will compile for you. You'll be personally met and greeted at the airport for both your arrival and departure. You'll be picked up with a private transfer from Cairo Airport and bused to the hotel. You'll have private transfer from Middle Egypt to the terminal of international departure in Cairo at the conclusion of the journey. And all your travel, tours, and transfers are by a modern air-conditioned bus. You'll also get 8 nights and 9 days of double accommodation in luxury hotels, 4 or 5 stars, as well as a boutique retreat center in Hermopolis. You'll have a personal English-speaking Egyptologist throughout, and myself, obviously, as your tour leader. You will have included all sightseeing tickets and permissions, which are difficult to get. And you'll also obviously have all your meals, starting with dinner on day 1, concluding with breakfast on day 9. That's 8 breakfasts, 7 lunches, and 8 dinners at luxury restaurants. Also included are your entry visas, all the tips and gratuities you won't need to worry about, and unlimited water on the tour bus. You'll also get personal headsets for the duration of the tour. And I need not mention all the fabulous views, the markets, the cultural activities, and the shopping experiences. Do not miss this chance to walk the sacred path where Western spirituality was born. And please don't wait. You know that the world is uncertain, and I may never offer this experience again. If you register early before August 25th, you'll receive $500 off. And believe me, this trip isn't going to get cheaper next year or the year after. So don't delay your destiny. It's a fair chunk of change, I know, but invest in your dreams, in what you find personally and existentially important. If it's worth it to you, the universe will find you a way. Start a GoFundMe. Tell friends and family. Spread the word abroad, far and wide. But most importantly, reserve your place today.